morning, Polyphony. Welcome. Good to see all of you today. If you're joining us live or watching this recording later, hope you're doing well in your lives and your ministries. Today's topic is a timely one, has always been one important to us, but seems so especially now as we move forward through past the pandemic and press on, bridging the gap between worship and youth ministry, artistic engagement, and leadership formation is our topic today with our presenter, Emily Snider Andrews. Emily is the Assistant Professor of Church Music and Worship, Leadership, and Executive Director for the Center for Worship and Arts at Samford University. And she believes worship lies at the heart of what it means to be a Christian disciple and seeks to enable Christ's church to worship with godly wisdom and spirit-led imagination. Emily is an ordained minister and has served congregations in Alabama, Texas, and California, and she especially is interested in worship, interested in the interlacing of music and theology, and focusing her research on evangelical worship, sacramental theology, and modern worship music practices. And she's married to Matt, a minister as well, and is a mother to 3 little ones. Today's topic, artistic engagement, leadership formation, bridging the gap between worship and youth ministry, is one that Emily is passionate about and does a lot of work with in her job at Samford University. Creativity and collaboration and intergenerational connections are important means of fostering a faith that lasts among young people. And today, Emily will share from her learning with Samford University Center for Worship and Arts, an entity dedicated to equipping congregations for intergenerational and artistic worship ministry. As Emily puts it, the wins in this work have often centered on creating structures for mentorship, bridging the gap between youth and worship ministry programs, and helping young people find multiple pathways to ministry and worship in the church. And today she'll conclude by offering some philosophical and pragmatic perspectives on the blessings and challenges of practicing these new paradigms, ones that empower teens to be full participants in the whole of church life. Emily, welcome. We're so glad to have you today. Thank you for joining us and presenting.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Kyle. Thanks for that introduction. And thank you all for joining me this morning and spending this time together. I told Kyle I will go ahead and share my screen. I had prepared some slides to hopefully keep everyone on track here on Zoom. I've got a few moments though in the presentation where I'll be asking responses and get feedback from you all. But we will go ahead and get started. And I was going to share who am I mentioned Kyle, but again, thanks for that introduction. A little bit more about our work at the Center for Worship and the Arts here at Samford. The center was founded in 2012, so it actually predates my time here at Samford. And as Kyle said, that we exist to equip congregations for intergenerational and artistic worship practices. I'm really aware these days that, as one former administrator here at Samford put it, I sit in the shade of trees that I didn't plant. And yet I've been a part of the work for a while now, and through our collective efforts, we have done a lot of learning on this topic. We are grant funded, so at this point we've received about $4.5 million in grants to do this work. We're a part of a national cohort, actually, of organizations like ours that are interested, especially in strengthening congregational ministries through youth-led initiatives. And so we have been doing some collective work with this group over the years. It's funded by Lilly Foundation. Part of our work at the center at Samford in particular is we focus that lens we look at that topic through the lens of worship. And so some of our ongoing initiatives that I'll share a little bit more about today, one of kind of our flagship program is Animate, and that's a summer program in worship and the arts for teens and the emerging adults and their adult mentors. We also oversee an ongoing cohort program where we'll walk alongside a group from a church that's interested in a project related to intergenerational worship. If you head to our website, we've created some free resources that are especially geared towards young people interested in worship leadership. We oversee a couple of online certificates in worship leadership. And then we also oversee a student residency program here at Stanford for college students interested in this topic, a co-curricular program, and alongside a faculty fellows program that supports us doing some research initiatives on this topic. So just wanted to share a little bit more about our work. And again, I want to point out that the work predates me. And so I'm really depending on others and not just myself in parts of our learning that I wanted to share today. Really what's at the heart of a lot of our work is that we have observed that a lot of people, a lot of young people in particular, receive this message. You're the church of the future. And oftentimes the intention behind that is a really good one. It's a hopeful one. It's you are the church of the future. So we believe in you and we want to empower you. And again, this is well intentioned. What we have been learning is that many young people end up interpreting this by highlighting in their own minds the future part, which means that they have missed the now part. And so we really want to make sure that we are equipping and empowering young people to be the church now. And that may be what lies at the heart of our work in equipping congregations to live out this mission in really concrete ways. So I did want to start actually to hear maybe a little bit of feedback, some responses from you all. Let me see if my slides will move. There we go. Yes, we're doing it, and I'm saying that for you. I do know that I know some of you, and I know about your ministries, and I know that actually you're even here today because you care deeply about young people and want to bring them, especially into the worship life of the church. And so let's start actually there. And I'm going, and maybe actually I will leave my screen presentation slides here, but maybe hear from a few of you in your own context. What's one way that you are championing intergenerational worship and ministry? If we could just have a few of you share, just to kind of see the lay of the land in terms of what our group here offers. How are you championing this in your own context? And feel free to just speak out.
Well, we can always do better, but we have such a great school program here in relation to the arts. We have so many young people in choir and in theater and playing instruments that we incorporate them as much as we can. Like, for instance, for our Good Friday service, all of my narrators will be people who are involved in speech and drama, young people who are involved in speech and drama in our high schools. We use children to light the candles every week, but again, like I said, we have to constantly remind ourselves, how are we involving young people in this service this week? So
Yeah, thank you, Chip.
We're this spring just doing a couple of times where the adult choir and youth choir combine and sing together, and so that's one small attempt. I've gotten some ideas from some of you and some people in this organization about just using children and teenagers to sing in congregational songs, to sing a stanza, just to sort of make that connection. And I haven't tried that yet, but I want to try that. I thought that was a really good idea too.
Yeah. Anyone else?
We are,
Again, knowing this, go ahead, Kyle.
I was just going to say, we have been engaging the students last year. Coming out of the pandemic, it was easier to start back youth ringers initially last year, and then slowly, bring back youth choir, and we're still rebuilding that. But like Chip and we try to ask ourselves how we're involving them each week by way of lighting the Christ candle or helping with the offering, those kind of things. So so all the small things and the more organized things like the ringers and youth choir, we're rebuilding and re-engaging with families.
Yeah. Oh yeah, those are all, and I know that all of you, I'm sure, could offer one way that you're championing it in your own context. If I could offer an encouraging word, we know, and this is not like we know, but the National Study for Religion and Youth offers that while there are no silver bullets for empowering young people to be part of the church now, the baseline is just getting them attending worship. So, again, if your congregation is encouraging attendance in public worship for people of all ages, but especially young people in your church, then again, yes, you're doing it. In particular, this all church gathering is the time and the space when young people, aside from parents, which I'll say a little bit more about, but it's part of the key to fostering a faith that lasts. Of course, though, all of us want to go more deeply than just getting them in the door and attending worship. And so today I'm going to attempt to lay out or build out a framework for how you might consider leveraging, especially intergenerational worship and ministry as a means of fostering faith formation among young people. And so I've got this kind of idea here, this photo here. I'm going to start with what I would say, and using an architectural metaphor, the foundation, and then we'll start putting up some walls or pillars there as we think about how you might actually do this. But again, our goal is very similar, I'm sure, to yours, is to go beyond attendance. And yet sometimes there are structures we have observed in our congregations that really don't make this easy to go beyond, again, just getting them in the door and at attending worship. In some cases, there are systems in place that are actually making it very difficult to consider new ways of forming young people, particularly through worship. And so, again, kind of sharing a bit about our experience and learning, but even with the cohort of folks that we're learning with alongside through our work with the Lilly Endowment. To start out with, I'll kind of lay out this foundation, but we worked actually really hard just a few months ago. We actually just received this video in January. We really wanted to be able to tell about this work in video form, kind of in story form. So if you would entertain this video here, I'll share it, but then I'll kind of walk through and more systematically some of the foundation that grounds this work. So here is a video to help tell the story.
When we're young, the world is full of options. Ever since we can remember, we've been asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? What are you going to do with your life?
Hey, excuse me, I'm sorry.
More than ever, discovering those answers feels impossible. But when we find it, the questions sound more like,
How can I do something that will make an impact?
How do I make things that people actually want to watch?
Yeah, I want to do this kind of stuff, but for a church, is that even a thing?
and at that point,
I want to do what you do.
that exacting moment in our lives,
I'm sure we can figure something out.
Really?
we need to be seen, asked,
I've been watching you, and I really think you'll be great at this.
You want me to choreograph?
Professor Corey? Think my dad called you?
Oh, yeah, Jonathan.
encouraged, and educated. All we need is an opportunity.
The body of Christ and how all different people can serve, and the film would be shown on these screens right here.
We need it by next Wednesday. Matt, can you do that for us?
Yeah.
Sanford Center for Worship in the Arts
Good. 3, 2, 1, and
exists to equip students and churches to engage with artistic worship. People are created to be creative. When we use God's artistry to mirror His glory, we see the church thrive.
It's really good. Yeah.
Really?
inviting leaders of all kinds to look deeper. Across generations and disciplines, into new experiences and expressions. To find out who we are. To create lifelong worshipers. When we all have a place to express the goodness of who God is. People of all ages share their giftedness for the glory of God, for the good of the church.
All right, thank y'all for that's a video that we hope the story kind of shares a bit about our work, but to kind of foster or break that down. Sorry, I'm trying to get, okay, maybe I can, some of my words I think we're cutting off here. So here's kind of in a systematic way of telling what that looks like. And I'm laying the foundation, so I'll offer kind of what are these foundations? And we would say that foundationally, we really need to make sure that we're considering the agency of young people. I wanted to offer today, I'm really thinking of young people as being around the ages of 13 to 26. So we're not just thinking about teenagers, not just thinking about young adults, but kind of that whole adolescent age group. And what studies are showing is that more than ever, young people really value their own agency. So in the context of worship and ministry, it's important that we empower youth to not just be participants in ministry, but also creators, co-creators, initiators, in which they are engaging their own ministry gifts and passions, both inside the walls of the church, but also outside. And so, yes, again, we want youth to attend. We want them to participate, but they should be given agency so that they can actually, that they can perceive their participation as not being a performance of something that only we, the grown-ups, do, but that they are part of the process. So, and sometimes I refer to that as part of the process and not just the product, even though the product may be a really good one. And so empowering young people to utilize their gifts. And this is one way that I would say as churches think about rebuilding, maybe especially post-pandemic, but even just in ways of reimagining their ministries, is that in some cases, especially related to worship, and this goes back really centuries, we have so narrowly defined the gifts that are applicable in the church that young people and adults alike actually have difficulty seeing their gifts used by God in the church. And if there's time, I'll say a little bit more about that, but we want them to see everyone's varied gifts as being applicable in and for the church. And we need to make sure that young people perceive that they have agency in that process. A next foundation that becomes important, let's see if my slides will move. There we go. We need to remember that congregations are very rich and dynamic communities where people of deep conviction engage in all kinds of important activities that sustain and nurture the life of faith. So as, again, you all are fully aware, I know you know that teenage years and these young adult years, developmentally, that's where faith really needs to take root. They need exposure to the fullness of your congregation's life, and they will need clear pathways to help them participate in those systems. And those pathways will need to include relationship building across the entire ecosystem of the congregation and all of its diversity. And so rather than viewing some of your congregation's life as maybe even unintentionally off limits to young people, invite them into all of it. One congregation that we worked with in Virginia, I was inspired by the way in which they put this into practice. It was a Baptist church. There were lots of committees, but it was always kind of assumed, oh, well, young people might not be interested in, finance committee, personnel committee, or, certain committees, but they just invited them into all of that work. It's also important to, sometimes when we think about the congregation as the full ecosystem, sometimes it gets messy too, and we might think that we should protect youth and teenagers and young adults from that. But as long as it's in appropriate ways to even let them in on the messiness, kind of this will reinforce the realness of the community to them. And this is an age where young people are really genuinely seeking authentic expressions of faith. This might mean in some cases that kind of a system realignment is needed, or that a particular congregation needs to reimagine the structures and the processes that would need to be created to get these multiple pathways into the church for young people. Another foundation here is intergenerational relationships. Foundationally, we need to recognize that teens and emerging adults need these relationships and the supportive community of adults who nurture their growing faith and provide them with many and diverse examples of what it means to be a faithful, church-connected grown-up. In some cases, not in all, but in some contexts, there are simply too few adults involved in the mentoring process of young people. Part of our learning is that the mentoring process is so significant and it really needs to go beyond just, the youth minister and maybe a few who are dedicated to being involved in serving the youth ministry. It needs to come not from such a narrow pool. And part of it is that without these models of adults being faithful at every stage of life, young people, we're learning, really do have difficulty imagining themselves as being faithful at every age if they can't see that at this very important stage, developmentally speaking, in their life and in their faith. So intergenerational relationships become really important. Another thing to think about here is the congregational system. So foundationally, in order to best engage youth and young adults, congregations will need to remember that ministry with and among young adults is not just the responsibility of the youth minister. This kind of gets back into that intergenerational relationships. Instead, we need to think about forming and nurturing youth as happening through a lot of different people and a lot of different practices. And we need to be more intentional about taking that entire congregational system into account. We'll be better equipped when we think about this, or think about the whole congregation as being connected to the youth ministry, rather than just kind of the youth ministry is this siloed thing over there for youth. If it's something that we all own and that we're all a part of, we'll just simply be better equipped to develop new models of ministry with and for youth. We'll also, as ministry leaders, be better equipped and even more mindful of ways in which we can step out of our own silos. And so in some cases, and this is not the dynamic everywhere, but where territorialism sometimes comes into play, where we might want to kind of protect what's our own, especially maybe where the finances are concerned, having this approach that, again, the youth ministry is all of our ministries. We can kind of, again, break down some of those silos, and hopefully some of at times, what comes with that is some territorialism that comes into play. Another foundation here is that we need to think of this kind of ministry model. It must involve young people in the core theological convictions of Christian faith and of your congregation's theological tradition. This sometimes gets lost in certain forms of youth ministry, where we might think that theology is just for the trained or the educated in those disciplines, or that you need to be a minister or have deep formative ties to a particular congregation in order to equip young people in this way. But and I know that in some cases we are living and existing in a post-denominational world where some of these ties are waning for young people and adults. But it's especially young people, again, these young people from 13 to 26 who, developmentally speaking, they really need opportunities to identify strongly with their faith through key Christian practices. And this especially happens in worship, is founded in worship. And then they need safe space to create and to develop their own informed theological insights that reflect on those practices. And they need to be provided with theological resources in relationship to guide them as their growing faith seeks understanding. This becomes, challenging to form faith without actually, especially in young people, without connecting it to these key practices and these key teachings. The point really here is that young people should be brought into the specifics of Christian faith and not just the very most basics, and even the specifics of your congregation's teaching of that faith. Another way of perhaps saying this is that teens really do need some religion today and not just some spirituality. And at some time, in some cases, we have sensed that this is countercultural, but there's this assumption that teens might not actually want religion, right? That they really just want a feeling of being spiritual. But actually, we're kind of discovering that that's really not the case. Teens are very ready to go with you into the depths of a theological vision of Christian faith if we are prepared to offer that to them. One way of thinking about offering it to them, one way that we have been influenced in helping teens enter this kind of theological vision of faith, it's through a pedagogical model known as PERTA, PERTA. We didn't create that or anything, but we've just adopted it from the education philosophy. And we found that it's actually really helpful when using worship practice as a primary means of forming young people's faith. And so to kind of break it down, and we might think about later how this could be applied, but we really want to seek to prepare students fully for what they will experience. And so this is especially important if a young person is experiencing something new, but it's also important to prepare them if they're not experiencing something new, but you might want them to experience it anew. So they've been practicing it their whole life, but now you want them to feel some sense of newness so that they can enter and respond or reflect on it differently. And they experience, so this is where they engage the actual practice of public worship, perhaps. They then are given space to reflect, so give students that opportunity to reflect on what they've experienced. One point about this process is that we have found it helpful to make sure that we first validate the young person's their own experience and interpretation of what that practice has entailed. But this is also where we, as grown-ups or those who have maybe more full or just simply because of our age, more diverse experiences, that we can offer them kind of insight. You might think of it as expert insight. It may not be that, but just where we can inform their reflections so that they're getting them outside of themselves. Then we want them to transfer what they've experienced, their reflection on it. We want them to think about the wider impact and the influence of that. So why does this matter? Why does it matter not just to me as an individual, but to our congregation, to our community, to the church, to the world even? There's kind of that so what, so that they can see the impact of their learning and experience more broadly than just themselves. And then by that token, we hope that they will be equipped and empowered to act. So if it matters to me and to the world, how does that affect how I actually live? This is again a philosophy from education, but we've really seen that it's important when it comes to teenagers' experience of worship to include this as kind of a pedagogical model to help them glean theological insights from what they're experiencing. Another foundation, and we're almost done with the foundations. I know that I'm speaking a bit more lengthy here, but the other foundation here for sure is going to be parents. And again, that probably goes without saying, I know with you all, but this is something that the National Study of Youth and Religion does point out, is that the single most important social influence on the religious and spiritual lives of adolescents is their parents. And so again, if we are turning to a model of youth ministry, young adult ministry, that sees that ministry as part of the whole congregation. So it's not its own thing, it's not its siloed thing, it's something that we all own. Then all of us too need to think about ways in which we can fully integrate parents into what we're doing, to support parents as the key influencers of their children. And so we might have to reconsider ways in which our programming and our particular contributions to ministry are all some kind of form of family ministry. So too often the church does fail to equip parents to be these integral faith formation partners that young people really need them to be. So that what ends up being communicated is that, yes, parents are important to the emotional, physical, mental development of their child, but for the spiritual formation, you can depend on others in the church, which is, that of course that will be true, but other systems, other leaders, instead of spending some time, energy, resources to actually equip those parents to be the most important spiritual influence that we know that they are in reality. So these are kind of the foundations for the way in which we've been learning and approaching, kind of bridging this gap between young people and the church. I wanted to kind of pause, if I may, and in light of kind of these foundations that we're thinking about here, I've received some feedback from you all. What are the obstacles to grounding your work on this foundation? So if we think about, I'm not really gotten to any practices yet, but if we think about this as a philosophy or as a way of re-envisioning our ministry with and for youth, what would be the obstacles in your own context that you would anticipate in this? And just pop up. You don't. I'm trying to see everyone, but yeah, just anybody, any kind of feedback.
So I mentioned,
pop up if you.
I mentioned earlier about our school system being so good. The downside of that is, like, for instance, almost every one of my choir members has gone this week to Disney World because their choir is taking a trip to Disney World. Our young people are just so incredibly busy, and it doesn't matter what day of the week it is. Sundays are no longer sacred. We just, we can bemoan that or we can accept it. I don't think we're going to change it, but sometimes getting young people involved is just, I've asked a particular girl in our church who is a senior and will be going into music theater. I've asked her to do things. I'm not going to be there that weekend. I'm off, auditioning for this or that. So I think that's probably one of the obstacles in our area. They're just so busy with other stuff. And how do we get parents to say this is a priority over basketball or over volleyball or over,
Yeah. Yeah, I can just echo that. Yeah, time is, with all the congregations that we work with, that's the number one. If there's something in the system that makes this difficult, it would be the time from teens and adults alike. Anybody else? What are some of the obstacles that you might anticipate or do anticipate, perhaps?
Chip articulated well my context too with that, and for others, I'm sure others could have offer a resounding amen to what Chip said.
Yeah.
And I think congregational systems is another hurdle because of just the mindset of the professional mindset of how we are organized here at Kirkwood, and relying on the professionals to be in the committees that are appropriately, that they would offer their strengths to. And youth don't necessarily are exhibiting those, obviously, because of life experience. So I can see that being a hard sell to our way of thinking here with the powers that be, if you will. Any others? Go ahead, Emily.
Well, no, I was just going to echo too that the congregational system and the professionalization of ministry, that's pretty pervasive. One thing that we have done some reflection on is, how, not all professionals go to seminary, but how even in the formation pools of the ministers and the leaders, it starts there, right? So I reflect on, my seminary experience and my own training, that, I didn't interact with youth ministers. Like, those are those people over there, like, doing the youth thing, and that's not my thing. And so even the ways in which, again, so well intentioned, but those are some deeply rooted systems that actually, again, make this kind of collaboration quite challenging. I'm even mindful of, like, how budgets are created, right? And how we, organize our finances and those structures. There's just some deeply rooted structures that if we were going to overhaul that, or if we wanted to overhaul that, it would, there would be some pushback for sure. Not easy there.
But I go back to one of your opening statements, Emily, that it really, I wrote down because I thought, gosh, what we're guilty of is saying you are the future, but we're not preparing them for the future if we're not involving them in in all those systems. We kind of pick and choose, don't we? Historically we kind of picked and choose, well, what we can empower them to do, prepare them to do, and what we think, oh no, you can't be a part of this. Yeah, it's really, it's a compelling case, argument.
Emily, your statement of equipping parents and involving them, and I am just looking at the church where I am, and there's some parental involvement, but there's also that side that kind of says, here are my kids, go do what you're supposed to do with them. And then they step back and they don't, they're resisting that equipping, if you will. And it's not everyone, but I just think about myself 100 years ago when I was a young person, and my parents were always involved.
Yeah.
So that's kind of interesting to me.
Yeah. No, I mean, even in my own, like thinking of my own childhood, and then as a parent today, which and I, have limited experience thus yet, but I do think that, time still maybe undergirds some of that. I mean, at least in parents that I talk to, just the stressors of time and managing all of that. I have been, hopeful in some of the materials that I'm seeing. So, parents may not be kind of on the ground, in the church involved with their students the way that maybe some of us have experienced, myself included. But some of the resources that are coming out have created some hopefulness for me. And I guess part of what I might hope to inspire if I were working with a church who is kind of wanting to re-envision and kind of maybe adopt some of this foundation, is that those time and energy, money spent on creating those resources to equip and empower parents is money well spent. So they may not be willing to offer necessarily the time in the church or as a chaperone or whatever terms we call it. But if we can still spend time, again, thinking of our own ministry, our own worship ministry, even as a part of family ministry, meaning that, yes, we are going to think about the family and the parents in light of, in the system and in what we're doing. Resourcing might go a long way. And again, part of my hopefulness stems from there's some really good resources. And I mean, Phil, I'd be happy to follow up. I'm especially impressed with one publication series, Faith Alive. It's from the Christian Reformed Church. They have just been putting out some wonderful family resources. And if you've never looked at the Faith Alive Christian resources, it's from the CRC, the Christian Reformed Church. We don't have to reinvent the wheel because there are some really good ones available. And I just, encourage you to, maybe even not think that you have to create them yourselves, but to resource parents and families in that way. Well, thank you for sharing kind of some of the obstacles. And I know that there are others because, again, this is at least what we think is a pretty countercultural model of ministry with and for young people, especially related to worship. I wanted to kind of move on here to building the things. So again, using this architectural metaphor, that's the foundation. But if we think about some walls or pillars that we could build as we think about this, I will say that I'm not getting quite as concrete as perhaps I could. I can tell you that kind of maybe more specifically about what we're doing here at the center. But I will say that there is this assumption that all of this has to be contextualized, and that what we're doing at the center may or may not work in your church and your church and your church. But the hope, though, is that some of the things that we are engaging in practice as it relates to worship, that you could imagine ways in which it could be put into practice in your congregation. And so kind of as we build this thing up, here's again, some more of what we're learning. I'll start with what we're learning is part of, again, maybe this is a foundational thing, but we've been promoting what we've been calling an ecological model of worship for youth ministry. And let me just say that again, we call it an ecology of worship for youth ministry. So part of our assumption is that when you begin to think of worship as this integral system in the whole life of the congregation. I know I'm talking to worship music ministry folks here. So you're probably like, yes, of course, the worship is central to the whole life of the congregation. But if we really take hold of that, then you're better equipped to imagine, to dream even of the connections that worship has with all that the church does. And I've kind of put these as maybe examples of most of what your church does. You might want to put more squares up there, and that's fine. But what's worth noting is that each of these systems affects the others, sometimes in helpful, sometimes in problematic or incongruent ways. What's worth noting, though, is when you understand this framework in this light, this is when teens and young adults can potentially boost the health of other areas of congregational life. So again, if youth is not just part of the youth ministry, but part of the whole congregation with worship at the center, we're trying to break down the silos. And ultimately, I would say, again, we're trying to bridge, for us, the gap, especially between youth ministry and worship ministry. So when we're bridging that gap, then we hopefully will begin to see more concretely how it is that young people are deeply formed through their full conscious and active participation in worship. So at the center of this model is the intergenerational community gathering. And unquestionably, the gathering community, I mean, I've already referenced a few other studies, the gathered community, next to parents, they create the most fertile soil for nourishing young people. And it's especially a community that includes the worship of all the ages of the church community. What I think is worth noting here is that we have not started with our talk about worship style, musical style, or even particular practices that we might privilege in the practice of this gathering of all God's people for worship. And again, that's why I would say that this notion is somewhat countercultural. Where did my slide go? Countercultural. It's because this, oftentimes we have started with a word about style. So we have actually, and I say we, even, maybe the experts from the academy, we've said, like, you must change your church's worship to accommodate young people. Sometimes, though, that's been at the expense of distancing older adults or other adults. We told them, no, actually, you've got to blend everything, because if you blend everything, then, you'll get something for everyone. When in some cases, what results is a perceived distance from everyone. And this has become increasingly common, but kind of, especially in the early 2000s, took root, that you have to have segregated worship. So you want to, in order to please varied and particular groups, you have segregated worship forms. And this practice, there have been a number of studies that have shown that this practice, especially when it comes to the young people's spiritual formation, this becomes problematic because, again, it's not typically practiced in a way that values intergenerational worship. So again, showing up for church, that is centrally important. Showing up for this intergenerational gathering, that's important. It's not quite enough, because we know that young people, they don't want to just know about God. They want to know God. And so they need to be able to connect this all church experience with the rest of their lives. And so we need some building blocks if we want them to say, this all church experience is important to me and valuable to me. It's formative for me because it's connected with all of my life. And so we get these other ends of what this kind of ecological model looks like. And part of that includes what we call portable practices. So portable practices, you might think of this as all the signs, all the gestures, literally all the practices of your worship. So these are your songs, your prayers, but it's also your handshakes and your hugs and your meals and your messages. And it includes, when we think of these as portable practices, it means that we want to envision these going anywhere. So yes, they're at church, but they're also at home, and they're at school, they're in the park, they're at the party, they're at sports practice, they're in the soup kitchen. Anywhere Christians are the hands and feet of God, we are naming and acknowledging that these are the practices of people of faith. So do teens realize that these things are related to church worship? Sometimes they do. But they might see the connection, but they might not. And for some practices, such as serving and caring for others, they may not link those to the worship of your church. And so young people need these portable practices, because without them, we run the risk of communicating to them that, hey, what happens at church stays at church. And we end up actually problematically creating gaps for them that, again, we didn't intend, and maybe we don't believe ourselves or envision ourselves, but we create this gap for them between their Sunday morning lives and their Monday morning lives. And many young people, and there's some data out there that suggests this, that they associate this gap with hypocrisy and inauthenticity in the church. And so we may need to find new ways to practice. So we may need some new practices. We may need to revision our own practices, such as how we read scripture, how we pray, how we sing a hymn text. We might need to add in some additional practices. We will definitely, I would say, need to create space to reflect. And that kind of goes back to that pedagogical model. Sometimes these things are happening, and sometimes there are literally practices that are happening in worship and outside of worship. But because we haven't spent any time reflecting with young people, they are not naturally making those connections. And if they don't make those connections, or if we don't encourage and create space for them to make those connections, we have observed that they probably will not make it for themselves, which, developmentally speaking, is pretty normal. So it's not speaking down to them. It's just that's developmentally where they're at. Diversity is another part of this model and it's very necessary for health and for growth and for sustainability. And again, I want to think about, diversity, diverse experiences. This is, applicable in many contexts, but as it relates to worship, young people need to be invited out of their worship homelands to explore something new, unfamiliar. So this could include taking field trips so that young people can experience the diversity of worship in other Christian communities. It could look like a young person in your own church sitting down and speaking with a senior adult on their favorite hymn. And then they learn that hymn on the piano or on the guitar, and they take it with a group to the nursing home to sing. So it could be actually, again, sharing these practices in the church with intergenerational communities in the church, and then taking it outside of the church. And it may seem counterintuitive to some, but we have observed, and others have observed, that young people actually learn to appreciate with greater depth and intentionality their own worship tradition and their own congregation's practices when they experience something different from their own. It's that juxtaposition of, whoa, this is really different. So, I actually get now why my church does it that way. And they become aware too that Christians throughout time and space have worshiped differently than they do. And hopefully that awareness gives us all, young people and grown-ups alike, a healthy dose of humility as well, that there's a lot of diversity out there through time and space, in terms of Christian worship, and so we can be humble as a result of that. It also means that when they do go out and experience this openness, and with openness this worship of others, they may too earn the right to ask the same of us, right? Like, so they'll come back and they may ask us to participate in expressions of worship that are unfamiliar. And hopefully if we've asked them to do that as a means of their own growth and development, hopefully we will be willing to do the same. Another on the next part of this is multiple attempts. And by that, we mean that young people need multiple attempts to engage worship practices and leadership. So leading worship or trying something new in worship, it can be really intimidating to a young person. And that which is intimidating to a young person sometimes is just, they kind of just turn off. Like, this is not really in reference to me, so I'm just going to turn off. Teens especially, and especially those that we might want to equip for worship leadership, and especially in the age of social media, they are hyper aware of the image that they are projecting and of their potential to fail publicly, right? None of us want to do that, but teens especially are hyper aware of that. And so we need to have an encouraging space where we can encourage teens to offer expressions of worship leadership or to practice worship in a way that creates some space that is playful, where it's okay to try, where we say that failure is simply never attempting it to begin with. And these spaces, again, they typically are more playful. It means that we should actually be thinking about trying to create space that is outside the Sunday service. It may actually be outside of any church context, in terms of kind of in the walls of the church. So again, this is where youth and worship ministry as family ministry becomes important, because it may actually be you know, hey, how can we, you know, this person, we really want to equip them to pray publicly in worship. What if they're, you know, praying, offering the benediction at the church picnic? What if we've equipped them, their family, with family worship resources that encourage them to actually practice their prayers at home? You know, where are we offering? Let's look and assess, where are we offering entry-level opportunities for worship participation and worship leadership? Some may be in the Sunday service, but others may need to be outside of the Sunday service. The other thing that, as we assess, you know, how is my congregation doing this? Are there worship elements that are repeated elsewhere outside of worship? You know, again, is there any kind of connections between the Sunday morning service and the Sunday afternoon picnic? What kind of connections can we offer that? The other thing, and some, I guess Kyle's comment about the professionalization of ministry got at this. You know, how well does our congregation handle or accept risk, to accept, you know, maybe imperfection in worship? How does our congregation respond to that? Are there ways in which we can cultivate a soft soil so that when someone, a young person especially, falls, it won't hurt too badly? You know, they're not hurt, we're not hurt. It might be a change in culture, but is there a way in which we can create that dynamic? Finally, here we're looking for leadership opportunities that are transferable. And really, we're thinking about transferable leadership in two ways. So transferable leadership are skills that are gained at the church, but then are transferred to other areas in their lives, or vice versa. So maybe they're you know, learning a leadership skill at school, but able to bring that into the church. We've already noted that young people are very busy. They often have multiple chances of training and equipping for leadership. And so we need to embrace that. We need to embrace their extracurricular, extra church life, so that we can then empower them to say, hey, that what you might perceive, the teenager or young person might perceive to be your real self, that real identity has a place in the church. And that's foundationally the message that they need to hear, is that real life self that you have, or that you consider yourself to have, that belongs here in the church, and that can be used here in the church. Transferable leadership is also when young people transfer leadership among themselves, and we've seen some really beautiful examples here of young people needing to see other young people engaging in the ministry of worship. So if the only leaders that young people ever see are the grown-ups, again, the subliminal message is that you don't really belong, or at the very least that you don't belong quite yet. And so in contrast, when young people see their peers and they're able to kind of engage in this peer-to-peer mentoring of celebrating and doing something together, again, it's this idea of agency, co-creators, they're initiating this act on their own. Then they begin, others who are observing, other young people who are observing that practice, they begin to see that, you know, we might be able to offer our own gifts in worship, and there can be a contagion result of that, saying, you know, hey, my friend is doing, my peer is doing it, they're encouraging me to do it, so I'm going to get on board. And so again, some of this means looking and creating new spaces for some of this to happen. If we could, I'm pretty almost done. I did want to hear, if we can, from a few of you, if time allows. I know that we're almost at time, but if you were to go all in this model, what might this look like at your church? Maybe just a couple of folks who might want to respond. Again, I've kind of offered a little bit about these practices that we have attempted, but what might it look like in your context?
Go ahead, Chip.
I was just going to say, actually, I think we're pretty close to this. We don't, you know, we allow young people to be involved and not expect perfection, and particularly our pastor Connie McNeil, our pastor of worship and discipleship, is always looking for ways to involve to involve the younger people. I do have a question though. Have you read any studies or heard any that show that younger people are actually going to churches that have, like, for instance, the Episcopal High Mass, and they're like, I'm done with contemporary, I want the foundation of something deeper? It seems like in our area, the church that has the Episcopal High Mass is drawing young people like crazy. Have you seen any studies about that? Because sometimes we think we have to have contemporary music to draw young people, and I'm not sure that's the case anymore.
Yeah, I would definitely say that is not the case. And I'm actually not quite sure that it ever has been the case. Maybe in the 70s and 80s, I can't speak to that era, but that has been a working assumption. That has been a working assumption that we and others have really tried to debunk, really because we see the fruit of it. You know, and this is where I would say that you know, when young people are plugged in to whatever worship style your church does, when they have a sense of, I'm included here, I belong here, I can serve here, and my gifts are appreciated and empowered, doesn't matter what musical style. So yes, it can happen in contemporary worship. It can happen in whatever definition of traditional worship that you prefer or that you embrace. That what we're seeing is that the full conscious and active participation, the empowerment of young people to use their gifts. Now, I would say the growing edge of, and again, it's no matter if it's contemporary or traditional, the growing edge, though, I think, is that we embrace more diverse and varied gifts. So, you know, and this goes back for centuries, music has been a privileged artistic contribution, right, to the church's worship. With good reason. I mean, a church musician myself, so I mean, yes, amen to church music, of course. But can we get more varied gifts? Can we empower them? Can the math nerd find a way to be plugged into? And maybe it may or may not be the Sunday service. But again, if we can go back to that whole congregation system, how can they get plugged in? So Chip, thanks for pointing that out, because that for me and for, I can speak for others here, like that would be something that we'd really want to work hard to debunk, that you have to have a certain worship style in order to attract young people. And I don't know of studies that have necessarily the data to suggest, but there is a suggestion that maybe more presentational forms of worship are less embraced by Gen Z than, you know, the authentic is a key word, and you know, it's a loose term, it's thrown around loosely, and it doesn't have a lot of helpful meaning, I think, but more participatory worship is something that's been valued, I would say.
Emily, I have a question. I've just arrived at a new church, and so that given its size, there's a lot of and the restraints of our space, there's a lot of services we have, and so the programming is very challenging. It overlaps a lot. There's not a lot of ways to have that synergy, or getting. So I've left decades long of the youth group always sitting in the one spot in the church, or they're involved, integrated in instrumentations and the orchestras and whatnot, and that's just not the case where I am. However, there are specialty services like Ash Wednesdays and things where the youth are involved. We've created a cyclical. Every time we have communion, we try to get the youth choir to sing for that service, kind of a deal. But listening to all that you're talking about, something that I might have to do here, and we've talked loosely about, is creating a specialty service. Maybe it's once in a quarter, again, to become more regular, but a family service maybe is an idea, or something that would be in our chapel, or the idea of, instead of baking into what's already in existence, the idea of creating a completely new service. Is that something that you think would be successful? Or I philosophically, holistically agree with everything you've said. And unfortunately, where I am, it's hard to get. Sometimes we're bumping against a lot of, brick walls with different things. Sometimes it's
I think there's a lot of.
You're good.
Yeah. No, sorry. I think pastorally, Carrie, there's a lot of wisdom to that. I would say that, rather than trying to, if something is very, the institutional weight, I hear what you're saying, like, but, there's a lot of institutional weight to what's already going on. And it might be very good. I'm not trying to imply that it's not good, but in terms of trying to bring in more young people, sometimes then we start elsewhere, right? So, start, as you said, maybe a whole other service that is regular or periodic, so that those practices and it hopefully creates a safer space then for young people to, again, having these multiple attempts for young people to be involved. If that is ongoing enough, then the hope, and I think that with some work, this could potentially be the case where, hey, this is happening and it's happening really well, and it's embraced by the congregation over here. What if we start bringing that gradually into the institutional space? So obviously that's a long-term, like, pastoral view, I would say, and there's a lot of, pastoral work that goes behind that. But I think that is a means. I can offer that we work with a congregation here in Birmingham, and this is connected to what I'm talking about here, but it's also connected to their post-COVID reentry as well. And so they do have an entirely new service, happens on Sunday mornings, every Sunday morning for them. This is a church that it's fairly large. It already had 3 services going on, and this is their 4th service. And it's their family. They just call it family worship. I mean, it actually, when you mention family worship, that's and so young people are empowered to participate in leadership in that service. But it is truly so it's one of these services billed as, like, there's not even childcare. So, like, even all the babies and toddlers are there, along with people of all ages. Yeah, but and I didn't talk about this today, but another kind of thing that we've seen is really necessary is mentoring from all levels. And so, in our case, the emerging adult, the college students, we mentor the college students mentor the teenagers. What really, where you really start to see some magic happening is then when you can empower the teenagers, to then mentor the children. And that is a model, because then they're actually, they just feel such a sense of empowerment. And I don't know if anybody's familiar with the state of flow kind of in psychology philosophy. That's like, there's this kind of energy that goes behind that. And so we've seen teenagers kind of enter this state of flow because they are being empowered to actually lead their younger peers. And anyway, I can see a model like that being pretty successful in a variety of contexts.
What was the name of that church in Birmingham? Curious.
It's Trinity United Methodist here in Birmingham, and it was either in, and I said January, so it was January of 22, not this past January. So, but as they were kind of rethinking, in January 2022, they started this family worship service.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Well, I'll go and say it's a promo plug. If I can, this video is only 1 minute, but I'd really like to share and invite all of you. We do have this summer program, Animate, for young people and their adult mentors. We have scholarships available for folks who might be interested in coming. If I could share just a 1 minute video before we end today, I just wanted to make sure that you all are aware of Animate. And if you would help us get the word out, it's a program where we see ourselves as putting into practice kind of everything that I've talked about today. And so here it is. And thank you for sharing with others. right. And that's all I've got, friends. But yeah, it's not too late. Again, if anyone's interested, feel free to message me. Kyle, that's all I've got for today, but feel free to wrap this up however you see fit.
All right, Emily, thank you so much for this. Has been great. A lot of good information and thoughtful ideas that we could take into each of our contexts, I'm sure, here. So thank you so much. This has been, for me, particularly really inspiring, and what I have needed as we're re-engaging with the families and rebuilding here following the pandemic. So thank you. And blessings on you and your work at Samford, and to all of you. I'll close with our good friend, Terry York's benediction for church musicians that he offered last fall in our Zoom session with him in November. And he's retiring at the end of this semester from Baylor University. And this has just been a timely benediction, as we would expect from someone from Terry. And now to you who've been called to sing amid the shouts and cries and slogans, to you who have been called to sing love to hearts full of hate, to sing truth in the cacophony of falsehood, to sing community in the barren places of isolation, to sing peace in the midst of deadly conflict, to sing embrace in the midst of denial. To you, musicians of the song of grace, may God grant always yet another song of courage to be hummed until God's words appear at the time of testing. Amen.
Yeah.
Blessings on all of you.
Yeah, thank you all.